So welcome, everyone. My name is Jeanette Basavius, and I'm going to do some introductions and welcoming. Thank you for coming tonight. I want to thank the Richmond Free Library for donating the space tonight. And I want to thank the Mount Mansfield Community Television, MMC TV, for being here live streaming. And the video will be available afterwards. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. So welcome to this program, A Kind of Refugee, the story of an American who refused to leave Ukraine. Author talk, book signing and conversation with Larissa Babij and Adrian Ivakhiv. So I'm Ukrainian-American, first generation, and I live in Vermont, and I'm part of a group called Vermont Stands with Ukraine. We formed soon after the invasion in 2022. I didn't know many other Ukrainians and Ukrainian Americans in Vermont. I'm watching her, she's giving me some cues.
A little further, sorry.
Like this, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, you guys
Okay.
strong.
Yeah. And we started Vermont Stands with Ukraine. So we've had rallies at the State House, vigils, events, art exhibits, picnics, cultural events, fundraisers, and so on. And I'm so excited that Larissa is here with us. I met Natalie, her sister, at one of our events, who taught us how to sing some Ukrainian folk songs. And she said she had a sister, Larissa, who lives in Ukraine. And I said, I really want to meet Larissa. So 2 summers ago, we got together at Oakledge Park and shared some beverages and talked. And it's such a pleasure to get to know you better, Larissa. So I'm going to share a little bit about Larissa. Larissa Babij is a Ukrainian-American Ukrainian. She was born in the US and raised in the Ukrainian diaspora in Connecticut in the US. She is the granddaughter of Ukrainian World War II refugees. Larissa moved to Ukraine in 2005 and has lived there ever since. Larissa was home in Ukraine when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, February 24th, 2022. Larissa chose to stay in Ukraine after it was invaded. She wrote letters to document her experience in Ukraine during the full-scale invasion in 2022. A Kind of Refugee is a compilation of those letters. Larissa will head to Poland after this and eventually back to her home in Ukraine. And then Adrian Ivakhiv is a Ukrainian Canadian. He was born and raised in the Ukrainian diaspora in Toronto, Canada. He is professor of environmental thought and culture at the University of Vermont and the author, editor of several books on environment, culture, media, and identity. He is currently completing an anthology called Terra Invicta, Ukrainian Wartime Reimaginings for a Habitable Earth. Starting this summer, he will hold the J.S. Woodsworth Chair in the Humanities at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. So it is my honor to introduce Larissa and Adrian.
Thank you, Jeanette, for this really fantastic introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to spend some time this evening thinking about Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which began in Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine began in 2014. The full-scale invasion began in February of 2022. It's been going on for a long time, and it's really meaningful to not forget about it. So I would like to share with you some of my personal experiences, some of my writings, to be able to kind of enliven what is going on in Ukraine, what the Ukrainian people are doing, what our life is like today. It's a great pleasure to be joined by Adrian, who I met in person for the first time today, but whose writing I have been reading online for years, and I'm very inspired by his thinking, which manages to bring together reflections on the arts, on a person's relationship to their environment, to their spirituality. And he also happens to have a Ukrainian background. So there's a lot of places in which we overlap, and I hope you will enjoy our conversation today. I would like to start with, one more thank you to my wonderful sister, Natalie, who lives in Richmond, now in Bolton, for years, and I've had the pleasure of being able to come back to this very beautiful part of the world every time I come to visit. So, thank you. And I decided, as an American citizen, to stay in Ukraine in the beginning of 2022. I had the option of leaving. I was invited and encouraged by the American government to leave Ukraine before Russia's full-scale invasion was launched. I didn't know what to expect, and so on February 24th, I found myself fleeing my home in Kyiv with a handful of friends, 3 cats, moving west without knowing where exactly we were going, step by step, surrounded by sounds that I had never heard before in my life, trying to orient, what was the best way to avoid any sort of contact with the Russian armed forces that were encroaching on the capital of Ukraine. We eventually made our way to Lviv in the western part of the country, and at that point I was receiving lots of messages from everybody, friends and family abroad, anyone I had ever met who knew that I was Ukrainian somehow found me through the internet. They wanted to know whether I was safe and what was going on around me. If you remember, if you go back 2.5 years, we really had no idea what was going on the ground, and certainly we had no idea what was going to happen next. And so by early March, I started sending mass emails as a kind of diary. It was both a letter to people abroad to give them an insight into what was happening around me personally. And I learned quickly that this was also a way to document a situation which was changing from day to day, from hour to hour. I was changing. And this book is a compilation of those letters that I sent and published on the platform Substack to friends, family, the general public living abroad. I'd like to share with you a passage that I wrote on April 21st, just to remember that time. During the course of the month of March, up until the very beginning of April, the Kyiv region around the capital of Ukraine, the suburbs where people had moved to have a nice life for themselves a little further from the city, were occupied by Russian forces. They were residential buildings were being constantly shelled. Civilians leaving their homes to get food were sometimes shot on the street, even though they were wearing white armbands to designate them as civilians. And in early April, when the Ukrainian armed forces liberated the entire Kyiv region and got the Russian forces out of there, they began to discover evidence of war crimes, mass graves, and learn of rapes and killings that were happening indiscriminately during that time. So this was all just kind of, we were coming to learn this information in April. I was living in Lviv still, and April 21st, 2022. Tonight in Lviv, the air is chilly, but with the texture of spring. I have to make a certain effort to keep sensing the war when it's happening somewhere further away. Still, my legs tingle as I think of the 1,000 or so people in Mariupol who remain underground in the tunnels of the Azovstal plant, which Putin has ordered to seal off as if to exterminate those inside. Yesterday, while writing a letter to people outside Ukraine about what is going on in Mariupol, I nearly wrote the word unimaginable, and then stop. This has happened. It cannot be outside the realm of imagination. It is real. It's history, if you will. I have spoken to women who escaped from Mariupol, taking in and communicating with them not only through words, but also through attention, our bodies in proximity. I knew in the moment, and I know still, that I cannot imagine what each of them went through. Imagination, its landscape and its limits, is always an individual matter. There's a difference between I cannot imagine and unimaginable. Russia's unjustified invasion and ongoing brutal assault of Ukraine, with its barbaric genocidal attack on civilians and soldiers outside existing international conventions of war, has drastically moved the threshold for what can be called unimaginable. I heard a story from the person who listened to the person who experienced it. In Bucha, a suburb of Kyiv, the Russian soldiers, young and scared, burst into a bomb shelter filled with women and children. They had them stand up and then shot every other one. Genocide is about destroying the group, so its individual victims are arbitrary. When you're standing next to someone who is being shot, the difference between you and someone else is negligible. I'm a grandchild of World War II. My mother is a Holodomor researcher. I've read Primo Levi. The cruelty that human beings can inflict on one another does not surprise me. The horror of what we have learned about what the Russians did to civilians in Bucha and throughout the Kyiv region took time to sink in. To pass through generations formed layers of resistance. From refusing to look, I have more important things to do, to sleeping on it, to disbelief, not that it happened, but that I am here, looking at these photos, that this is happening here, where I am. There are two ways to lose touch with the war. One is by feeling safe and comfortable and unperturbed, secure in what you know, while the other is by entertaining threats and potential dangers, including that of nuclear attack, so that your senses become garbled and clouded by fear. You need to do something to make the events of war more concrete. Whether it's going to the place where it happened, talking to a person who lived through it, formulating a question and looking for the answer, taking a walk or a shower, and remembering where you are and what you are doing. I've made a practice of repeating, I have never stood next to someone who is being shot. Not, how lucky I am not to be the person who was shot. Or how fortunate and privileged I am never to have had the experience of standing next to someone who is being shot. Just the facts, made proximal through sentence construction. I have never stood next to someone who is being shot. Such experiences form people for generations. My grandparents saw their friends murdered, lying by the side of the road as they fled Ukraine in 1943. They had planned to escape together in the middle of the night, but my grandfather had an intuition that it was better to wait until morning, while the friends left according to plan. How do you live with that? What about the boy who witnessed his mother being raped for several hours and then she died? His hair went gray overnight. Someone is already thinking about how he will recover. I am still stuck on how can I live with this? I first felt shame on February 24th as I was running away from Kyiv in fear of the Russian advance. I felt ashamed before my sister in the US, who was absolutely right when she urged me to leave the previous Sunday, and before my grandmother, who turned 95 that day, for all she had done to plant me in America with the promise of a good life. Here I was, participating in history's repeat performance. The shame of being a refugee, of lacking the courage to stay and fight, of failing to defend one's home and one's people, is the shame of leaving what's yours for the sake of self-preservation. It's recognizing in yourself the compulsion toward moving constantly, whether away from the site of danger or wound up in unceasing activity, so as to keep from feeling the pain and horror and responsibility of witnessing and living with crimes we are now learning to imagine. I think I will read the next passage later, or should I keep reading now?
Up to you, I don't know.
I'm sorry, can you hold the microphone like an inch further from your mouth? 'Cause there's a
Sure.
little,
Is this better?
that's a lot better, just because there's a little funny thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess we can do a little conversation at this point, and then we'll move on to another passage. Okay, so thank you, first of all, to Jeanette and to everyone who's part of organizing this and who's here, but most of all to you, Larissa. And is the sound good? Okay. Thank you, and congrats on the book and on your perseverance, on the decision to stay in Kyiv, but also to communicate the experience of being there, of traveling around, of being engaged with people who are defending their country, and of coming here to also to speak to us and to share your experience regularly online and now through this book. So I'll start with a few things that we have in common, as Jeanette hinted at, because there's a history, there's kind of a shared history that a lot of Ukrainians touch on in multiple ways, in different ways. So it's good to start from that. Our families both come from Halichina, which is Western Ukraine. My parents, your grandparents, both went through that experience of World War II, traumatic experience of losing their homes, of getting caught up in the chaotic aftermath of this war in which Ukraine was kind of caught in a vice grip between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Red Army. Western Ukraine was ultimately taken over by the Red Army. It had not been part of the Soviet Union. My parents, your grandparents, got moved around in various ways by one force or another, ended up in DP camps, displaced person camps, and came here to North America, Canada, the US, as refugees in order to reconstruct the world that they knew, which is what we grew up with. So this diaspora Ukrainianism is something that we also share. And that difference between growing up with this sort of second generation or removed experience of stories told about trauma, about war, and on the other hand, actually living through it directly is something that I want to get at because it's so central to your book and your writing. You describe growing up with the ephemeral knowledge of mass violence, and those are the stories that you heard, that I heard, that other Ukrainians have heard from, direct stories. My parents being herded on a train and shipped to my father to Germany to a factory where he was forced to work. Stories of escape, stories of my uncle witnessing the shooting of Jews in their town of Brody, which was more than half Jewish and Polish before the war, where my grandfather was a Ukrainian Catholic priest. Ukrainian Catholic priests were being either rounded up and shipped to Siberia or forced to convert to Orthodoxy and allegiance to the Moscow Patriarch. He heard that. Some of his friends got shipped to Siberia, but he gathered his family of 8 kids and fled over the mountains to Slovakia. So these are stories that we've heard, that we've grown up with secondhand. And then there's, at some point, that ephemeral knowledge of mass violence becomes direct experience of violence, in your case, being there during this war. And I want to ask you about and have a conversation about how and whether that experience of conversion from ephemeral knowledge to direct experience confirms something about the ephemeral knowledge that we both grew up with. So there's background to this, which I want to get into. Post-Soviet Ukraine has often been described as a country torn between Ukrainian nationalism in the West and a kind of Sovietism or post-Sovietism in the East and in the center of the country, or the center being somewhere in between the two. Seen historically, the nationalism consisted of various ways to keep the dream of a self-determining Ukrainian nation alive. And there were politically quite a broad spectrum of ways of doing that, from the revolutionary socialism of Mikhailo Drahomanov, Ivan Franko, and many others, to the anarchism of Nestor Makhno and his followers, to the integral ethno-nationalism of Stepan Bandera and his followers. So pretty broad spectrum. And in a country that is trying to establish its own self-determination, you would expect that over the decades. But the nationalists, so again, I'm using that term pretty broadly, pretty loosely, have been united by the perception that Russia has rarely, if ever, had Ukraine's best interests in mind. This was well phrased by the Ukrainian communist literary figure, a leader of the literary renaissance of the 1920s, Mykola Khvilovey, who I'm going to talk a little bit more about because part of your book gets into that history. In his call, Away from Moscow, Het vid Moskvy, Khvilovey was the leader of this literary renaissance that took place in the then capital of Soviet Ukraine, Kharkiv, which is currently under attack with the Russian army moving closer. There's a great film about that called Slovo. What is it?
Budynok Slovo or
Budynok
just
Slovo?
Slovo, I think.
Home Slovo, House Slovo, Slovo House, which is about a building built, a 6 or 7 story building built for artists, writers, poets, filmmakers in Kharkiv in the 1920s, where some of the most creative people in the country lived with their families, and ultimately where they were destroyed in the 1930s. Khvilovey himself gathered some of his closest friends, artists and writers, in a room, and this was 1933, after arrests had begun on artists and writers by the Stalinist authorities, and he put a bullet through his head because he claimed to be taking responsibility for his role in what happened. So over the course of the last 10 years, it's been said that Russian actions alone have proven the nationalists correct. And I want to talk about this. I want to ask you about how this impression squares with your experience of Ukrainian on-the-ground perceptions of the history of Russia and Ukraine. And I'm going to quote a few pieces from your book to build on this. So it's sort of a multiple-leveled question that we can talk about. You wrote, "Sensing that the Hollywood movies I watched could tell me nothing about my grandparents' wartime experience, I began to doubt whether I could trust that the world around me was real. But the colorful lands of the folk songs I loved were also a fantasy world, detached from the cars and wall-to-wall carpets that were indisputably present in the American suburbs." So in a sense, both of these felt equally unreal. The stories about historical Ukrainian history and the kind of fantasy world that young Americans were growing up with in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
10 pages later, you write, "If I came to Ukraine drawn by a desire to encounter that precious quality that my grandparents were so heartbroken to leave behind, then in Ukraine, I learned to see and value the firm principles upon which, this is ironic, I think, American democracy was founded. Hard to see beneath the contentious jockeying that substitutes for American political life today. Ukrainians showed me through their gaze that I walk through the world with a sense of freedom as given, the gift of my American upbringing. And I want to echo this. This is what I experienced when I was in Ukraine in 1989 and 90 as a Canada-USSR scholar. They told me that I walk like a North American. And you know, there's a certain kind of energy that was not the energy of late 1980s, late Soviet Ukraine, which is kind of this depressive, the stores were pretty empty, lots of jars of pickles, but queues for bread. Good bread, different kinds of bread, but you had to line up for it. The Ukraine that you went to live in was a little different now, 20 years later. But in a sense, you came to the reality of what's still possible in America when you came to Ukraine and sensed that there's a real living dynamic process going on there. And I sensed that in 89, 90, 91, 93, I was back there. And it's a process that Ukraine has experienced through these waves of rising up, which happened back then, 33, 34 years ago, again in 2004, again in 2013, 2014. Where it leads is a different story, and every time it ends up in a different place. And you know, where it'll end up after the war is also a different story, and hopefully wide open, but we'll see. Okay, you write later, it's not interesting today to say simply that my grandparents were right. Instead, I wonder about what was wrong with that promise of a multicultural global world that distracts its citizens with great international mobility and connectedness while allowing for the rise of a country whose hunger for power and dominance could lead them to commit genocide in the name of squelching national spirit, or in their words, denazification. Okay, so I want to rest on that, because there's a bigger question here that all of us in this room have to contend with. How is it possible that genocide has come to Europe again? We know that it's, you know, people say never again. Europeans have said that for decades. It's not. That's not the story. It's happened again. But it's happened in other places too. And we know there are wars that are kind of genocidal happening in other parts of the world now. So, how do we account for, in this case, it's a Russian state that has wanted to re-imperialize itself. And Ukrainians have said, no, we don't want that anymore. Do we look to flaws in the kind of, you name it, universal humanism, universal humanist values? Do we look for other sorts of processes, maybe longer-term trajectories? And that's what I want to kind of bring into the conversation. Ukrainians today, many of them, artists and writers, speak of Ukraine as being in a colonial situation with respect to Russia. The Soviet Union was, in a sense, it's commonly called an empire, but it inherited imperial characteristics from the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire wasn't just a kind of, you know, local phenomenon. It spread across a larger expanse of territory than the British, the French, the Spanish, or any other empire. From Europe to the Pacific Ocean. It took over lands that were inhabited by indigenous peoples of various kinds. It's never had to account for that history. We can argue to what extent Britain, France, other colonial powers, the US as a kind of quasi-colonial power in some parts of the world, have accounted for their colonial histories, but we know that Russia has never accounted for that 400-year-old colonial history. So there's a bigger picture. But the bigger picture is also colonialism as a global phenomenon. And the bigger picture for me is that this war that Russia's waging against Ukraine is not just against Ukraine, and it's not just by Russia as we think of it. It's being waged by a fossil fuel superpower whose economy up until a few years ago was largely based on gas and oil being sold to Europe, to China, to other countries. And nobody's stupid. And the leadership of Russia is not stupid. They could see the writing on the wall, just as Exxon Mobil can see it. Fossil fuels are on their way out, which means Russian power is on its way out. How do you reestablish itself so that the current leadership that goes back to 1999, 2000, when Putin got in, can maintain its control by re-imperializing, by beginning to take back some of the land it considers itself to have lost. Ukraine being the most prized colonial, long-standing colonial piece of property that goes back, different parts of Ukraine, go back to different periods, but essentially to the 1650s or something like that, when the Ukrainian Cossacks made a deal with, anyway, it's a complicated history, which I won't get into. But the fact is that this is a fossil fuel war that is re-imperializing because that's how the powers that be in our world think they can survive. As we move away from fossil fuels, as climate change intensifies around the world, as that elicits migrations of people to Europe, to the US, that also elicits movements to close borders, to prevent those migrants from coming in, and to retain control of what we have. So in other words, the experience of Ukrainians today is the experience of billions of people in decades to come. It's not a relic. It's something that we all should get used to. That's my take on it, which I'm writing about with other Ukrainian authors and others. And so how do Ukrainians on the ground feel their place in the world is being defined? I'm going to read another quote from your book, which I really like because it resonates philosophically with me. It's actually something I've written a book about. So the difference between. So here's a quote. "I used to think that you are formed by what happens to you. After living in a country that's been at war for nearly 10 years, I've realized," you write, "that you are formed by how you respond to what happens to you." A lot of stuff happens to us.
Yeah.
How you respond to it defines who you become. And that's where I want to have a bit of a conversation, because Ukrainians are becoming in the process of resisting the invasion by this superpower next to them. But it's difficult, it's messy, it's complicated. Maybe a few months into it, and much of your book was written in the first year and a half.
Yeah, the book is the first year.
There was a sense of energy that, Ukrainians surprised everybody in their defense. And there was a sense that we can do this. And now it's not as clear because the solidarity that Ukrainians felt has gotten messed up by some of the Western partners who could help them economically and militarily. So I want to ask you, where are Ukrainians at now? And how are they prepared to define themselves moving forward to respond to the situation? And how does that implicate all of us? We get distracted, for good reason. There's a war going on in Israel and Palestine and Gaza. And of course, we take positions on these things. And we get involved with our own politics. We have an election coming up. We take positions on them. Sometimes we avoid taking positions because we know our neighbors are a little different on this and we want to get along with them. So things get complicated. There's a clarity in war, which if I can bring in one more quote, and then we'll talk, and then we'll hear you read some more. Final quote, maybe. Where is this? If I can find it here. Life is sharper and vision more acute when pressed up against death. So you've been in a situation where life is sharper and vision more acute, and therefore you feel the need to speak. I experienced some of that when I was in Ukraine because there was a sharpness in what was happening. There was a real cultural vibrancy. You have been in Ukraine at a time of cultural vibrancy when the arts, and that's what I want to come back to if we have time, to talk about the arts scene, the theater scene, which you've been involved in, which I also had been involved in Ukraine, and which connects back to the 1920s. But we may not have time for that. So, yeah, let's hear your thoughts on how do we respond to what happens to us? Those of us who are here, far from the scene of where that war is really happening, but also those of us who are there when things change in the broader picture that shapes how that war is being played out.
Thank you. I appreciate, Adrian, you giving context to where this book is happening and kind of the many challenges that we're facing in the world right now. And one of the things that kind of kept going through my mind as I was listening to you is that behind all of these greater trends, be it climate change, be it political shifts, be it an imperial government, all of these things are done by people. And I think when, if you're talking about an authoritarian regime like Russia's, there is a point at which the individual people living in that country, they do not have power. The government becomes so powerful and so oppressive to the individuals that your own voice doesn't matter. We can remember the murder of Alexei Navalny in prison earlier this year. I mean, how blatant and atrocious was that when a country that is already imprisoning a person and keeping him absolutely under lock and key takes it upon themselves to murder them also. I mean, so one of the things that was really kind of one of the most enlightening things about the experiences that I've written about in my book and was able to reflect on in the process of writing is the quote that you landed on about how it's what I do, how I respond to what happens to me, that actually makes me who I am, and it shapes the world. I think, I know that I growing up definitely had a sense that, I was shaped by the fact that my grandparents had to flee their home, and the decisions that they took to leave Ukraine were made under extreme duress. They may not have survived had they not taken those decisions, and yet those were decisions that they made. You are always making decisions, and these larger trends that we can look at, through systems that we can analyze with hindsight from a distance, they actually happen because individual people make particular choices. And that's something that I kind of want to keep bringing attention to, especially in the case of the United States, because I feel like we're at a very, tenuous moment right here when we do live in a democracy. Guess what? We really do. And each one of us really has a voice when we use it. I left the United States, almost 20 years ago, because I could, because I thought that democracy just sort of happened by itself and it was boring, and why don't I go move to a country in Eastern Europe where nothing's formed yet? That was exciting. And yet I realize, because I made that decision, and because a lot of people of my generation also kind of took this American democracy for granted, it has atrophied. A lot of things, I think, have atrophied in our country because of so many people thinking, well, it's just going to do its own thing. And now we're in a position of like, what are we going to do about it? But we can look at Russia. And Russia is a country where, I think the last mass protests were in 2012, when people did come out en masse in Moscow and were arrested and beaten and detained, and progressively in, I think it's 2014, correct me if I'm wrong, or 2015, when Boris Nemtsov was murdered, and then Alexei Navalny was attempted to be murdered, and then finally murdered. Like, there is a point at which, when you let go of your power as individuals to participate in this messy game called democracy, those systems that we've put in place, they do begin to run on their own inertia. And I think Russia's project is not only an imperial fossil fuel resource rich, let's just let the wealthy get wealthier. That's there, for sure. But there's another more sinister dimension to it, which I think was set in motion with the Soviet Union, when so many people were, I'd say, murdered into living for ideas, sheer abstract ideas, the brighter future promised by communism, where your reality is actually living, near hunger, waiting in lines just to get bread, and kind of this huge disconnect when, by the time the Soviet Union was collapsing, it was, I don't know, excuse me, I'm going too far off the field, but to kind of come back to what we're doing now. Something that my experience of living through war has showed me, whether I want it or not, is just that there's a kind of visceralness to being reminded of your own mortality, your own weakness at any given moment. I'm not smart enough. I don't have all the answers. I need somebody's help, and they're also incompetent. And that's who the Ukrainians are, and that's what they're fighting with. And I think that is something that really can be inspiring to Americans to not be intimidated by the seeming power of the systems we've built. They really are powerful, and they function, and that's great. But to not have to wait until everything completely collapses and falls apart to kind of reassert yourself as individuals, in communities, in conversation. And that's my main thing that I just keep repeating, because I think it's relevant in any situation. Is there anything else you'd like me to address from the list of questions and topics?
Do you want to read more?
Yes, actually, I have a relevant reading. It fits right in with this, because...
Larissa, can you hold the mic a little
Further. This, how is this?
It's unnatural to do it.
Yes, because some microphones need, is this a good distance? Yes, all right. Thank you for the speaking up. No, I appreciate it, because I don't know. So what I had read to before was April, and by early May, I was still living in Lviv, but beginning to look at what my own role in this situation of my country being an utter annihilatory attack what perhaps would be a more appropriate way to direct my efforts. May 6th, 2022. I admitted to my friend Ilya that the thought of joining the army myself is recurring more frequently. He said, "Come on, you've got 3 women among the new recruits in the volunteer battalion." My body that has hardly danced for 3 months is eager to move around outside. Imagine running and jumping and shooting things in the spring sunshine. We're planning to send this unit into battle on Saturday. All my further questions, driven by sincere and innocent curiosity, sink stupidly back into my mind. I admit to my friend that I am afraid to go into battle. This is the closest I've ever felt to the war. Not because the person I'm talking to is preparing soldiers for deployment, but because I can imagine myself there, training. And I can feel the significance of leaving the training grounds to go into battle. And I can feel my own resistance to it. The only thing between me and battle is my own decision. Which is a more powerful connection to the war than hearing explosions outside your window while you're going about your civilian business? In the latter case, those explosions are an imposition, Russia's disruption of my life in Ukraine. Whereas joining a volunteer battalion, picking up arms, or fighting for Ukraine's liberty in any way, decisively and courageously, is acknowledging the situation as yours and that you are going to do something about it. First you. And only then are you together with everybody else who is also fighting. Ilya calls me the next day to make sure I understand that I'm a greater asset to Ukraine's victory working at my computer, raising money for their battalion's needs from abroad, than as one more body in the line of fire. Yes, I understand. That same day, I meet a veteran medic from the US who has come to spend a month helping the Ukrainian cause. As we chat, he begins to demonstrate the procedure for breaking open a door with a fellow soldier when you don't know who or what is on the other side. He guides us into position. We discuss where each of us is looking, how we start at different angles and then move closer together to fill the gap when the door opens. It feels like a dance, the split awareness of where I am in relation to my partner and his line of fire, where my line of fire is in relation to my partner. Our focus in the exercise was completely on how we move together to never end up in one another's line of fire. But what about the person on the other side, ready to shoot us? I never thought my dance training might be useful preparation for clearing buildings of enemy personnel. Until February 24th, I was studying and teaching the Feldenkrais method in classes where students are encouraged to sense themselves moving through space, to become more aware of their timing, the subtle differentiations between faster and slower, breathing, reducing tension. In the weeks following Russia's escalation, it seemed like this training would lead me to help refugees and people who had experienced traumatic events, who needed attention and comfort. Instead, trained to listen to what I am really doing, to sense what I need, to clear space around physical sensations and emotions, to be able to think coolly under stress, I've discovered a warrior. I'm going to read a couple more sentences from that passage. My friend Roma was killed near Kharkiv today. Earlier this week, I had sent money for his territorial defense unit, and we exchanged a couple warm words in Telegram. He was a vibrant member of our Kyiv Lindy Hop community, a photographer and a dancer. Was. I have to admit that everything I had felt up until this moment was not what I feel now. Now that a person who is one of my people, in the very specific, tactile sense, a distinct living part of my social fabric, has been killed in the basic act of defending our country. The war keeps coming closer and closer, encroaching from all sides. Can you feel it enough to keep it in focus without letting it carry you away? That was May, so 2 years ago in a month. And even when I'm reading this and sharing it with you right now, it feels so hopeful and a little bit naive. One of the questions you had asked was about kind of what Ukrainians are now, today, after 2 years. And one of the things that we are is less. There are just less of us. And it makes the responsibility of each one of us who is still here right now, who is sensing and feeling and aware of how important it is to keep Ukraine alive, not just because there's a bunch of people there and they deserve to live, of course they do, but Ukraine as a country, as a political nation with distinct borders, so that it can protect itself and its people alone without becoming the burden of some other nation, without becoming enslaved by some other nation, is really important for all of us. And every day that I wake up, that the war is going on one day longer, that the city of Kharkiv, which was the capital of Ukraine, actually Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s, has a very vibrant cultural history that goes way back beyond the 1930s into the 16th and the 17th centuries. It's been a university town. Even when it was primarily Russian-speaking, it had a very distinct Ukrainian heritage. And that city today, because it's so close to the Russian border and can be indiscriminately bombed by missiles and bombs sent from Russian territory very easily, Ukrainians don't have very many means to be able to strike Russian launch positions on Russian territory. We're just watching it be destroyed while the people of Kharkiv continue to have cultural events. I haven't been there since a number of years ago, but I have friends who've traveled there recently and in the past couple of years, and they have music concerts and bomb shelters. They have, what are they called? Seminars, discussions, speaking of cultural memory, and it's something that, Ukrainians are continuing to live on the edge of death. It's very important for them to maintain their life for as long as it lasts, or as short as it lasts.
Shall we open things up maybe to questions from the audience? Yeah.
Do you have an extra?
I recently read an op-ed by someone who really seems to know what's going on, and they talked about, what's that little country that begins with M that's on the southern border of Ukraine?
Moldova.
Moldova. So basically they said that Ukraine has got to get rid of every last piece of Russian invasion throughout its entire territory. Because once you let Russia get a piece of Ukraine, I don't care how big, they will never leave. And they will slowly destroy Ukraine inch by inch over years and years and years, and mess with the government, mess with everything, and just destroy it. Where are the Ukraine? So it seems to me this war has got to be won, and the Russians have got to be kicked out of every single inch of Ukraine. Where are the Ukrainians around this? Are they? I mean, I so hope that they've got. I mean, I know in the beginning the Ukrainians had the spirit and the will. Is it still there? I mean, do they know deep in their hearts I mean, I'm not even Ukrainian, but I know, and so I think they must know, 1,000 times much more than I know. But are they in it for this kind of a long haul like this?
The short answer is yes. I appreciate very much you drawing attention to the fact that Ukraine has to win. Wars are won and lost. Any kind of a quote-unquote frozen conflict is just an abysmal, in this case, it would be a murder machine. What Ukrainians are struggling with is the loss, a lack of human beings to participate in fighting the war, great lack of weaponry. And that's something where other countries can help. And what I see that's hopeful is that some European countries, including Poland, definitely Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, I think Finland, Scandinavian countries, even France has become more supportive. They're beginning to see that even if NATO as a bloc is unwilling to participate in a war effort to help Ukraine win and defeat Russia and make it impossible for Russia to continue destroying Ukraine, individual European countries are becoming more prepared to, speaking publicly about their commitment to aiding Ukraine's military effort. One of the interesting things a friend of mine who's a political scientist said in a lecture not too long ago was that another reason why it's useful for the United States to keep supporting Ukraine as a country is that if they let Ukraine fall, they will still end up supporting, insurgencies within Ukraine, but then it will be multiple insurgencies, and that will be really messy. And, at this point, when it's really in everybody's interest, okay, besides Russia's, but, in anybody who supports a democratic, free, rule of law world, it's definitely in everybody's interest to have Ukraine stand as a political nation. Okay, there was one back there.
How can they win if both all the Western powers tell them they can only use the weaponry we give them
Closer to the mic, please.
defensively? Shouldn't Ukraine be able to use these weapons offensively? But everyone is afraid that if they do that, they will enrage Russia. So what is the answer to that problem?
Yes, I believe that Ukraine's military should decide how to use its weapons in its defensive war. One of the things that's worth bringing attention to when people, primarily it's in the West, who say, I'm not going to do something because I'm afraid that Russia will escalate. We should remember that Russia escalates in its own time, on its own terms, regardless of what Western actions are. Generally, when the West demonstrates force, demonstrates uncompromise, Russia has stepped back. And it's precisely when Russia sees inaction and weakness that it continues to push further and test Western resolve.
Kind of like a cancer behaves.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, Larissa, if you could speak to the cultural dimensions of the conflict, because in things that I've read from Putin decades back, he denies Ukraine's existence as a country, and it seems that there's also existential reasons why Russia needs to occupy Ukraine, like St. Sophia's Cathedral, one of the holiest churches and oldest churches is in Kyiv. It's not in Moscow. Things like that I think are, as I said, there's sort of an existential identity issue for Russia. I mean, is it as significant as it is sort of in my mind. It seems like that's part of, not to say that it isn't about oil, but I think that there are some of these other dimensions. And if I could add a second question, just because I was in Ukraine 2005 to 2008 working with civil society organizations who were incredibly vibrant and dynamic, and I'm sort of just wondering where they're at in all of this that's going on right now.
Civil society, you mean?
Civil society, yeah.
Okay.
In general.
Yes. Thanks for the question. I don't know if you have anything to add, I'll let you, but as far as Russia has made a very loud claim for Ukraine to justify its war and invasion and to legitimize it in the eyes of the Russian people and perhaps to make it look legitimate in the eyes of the world. Kiev and Rus was a kingdom that was actually started by Vikings who came from Scandinavia down the Dnieper River, and it existed long before Muscovy, which is actually the root of modern-day Russia. So it's a pretty far reach that Putin is making to go beyond the origins of Russia to try to claim Kiev and Rus as its own territory. As far as, is there anything you'd like to add to the history?
Just that it is a very far reach, it's mythology, but it's also mythology that's been repeated by generations of Russian historians. So a lot of Westerners who study Russia, who have not studied Ukraine or other countries in that part of the world, or the peoples who got colonized by Russia, believe that mythology, which is unfortunate. But yes, of course, Russia emerges sometime in the 1600s or something out of Muscovy. Was it Peter the Great who decided to name it Rossiya because it sounded better than Moscovia and because it allowed it to connect to Kiev and Rus? But it's a long and complicated history, and there are versions of it, and it's time for the Ukrainian version to be heard. Although, I mean, there's mythology on every side, and there's real history, and most of us don't know the real history.
Just to add, as a person who works in Ukrainian culture and I'm a translator, there's been a huge boom of just work that scholars who work on Ukraine, with Ukraine, are performing really valiantly to bring to the world's attention in English, the history and the nuances of Ukrainian culture and what makes it distinct. Briefly about civil society, this is what Ukraine stands on to this day. Even if you think about Ukraine's defense, beginning in 2014 especially, at that moment, Ukraine's army was completely depleted by the pro-Russian President Yanukovych, and it's really Ukrainian people through these networks that are often personal, often informal, often extremely redundant. And how many people today, I have friends traveling from the United States, and I have my medic friend in Ukraine, and he sends me a list of what kind of supplies they need, and I send the list out, and we're bringing hemostatic bandages, and whatever it is that's needed, we're still functioning in that way. And I think that's the great power of Ukraine. The thing that's most difficult for Ukraine is really figuring out how to organize themselves. That's something where they definitely face challenges also. But this sort of power of people to do things at scale, small scale, but really actively, is definitely something that keeps the nation alive.
I want to go back to the first comments that were made about the op-ed, about it's all or nothing kind of thing. When I was in Ukraine in 2019, we were with a young man who, at that point in time, of course, the war was already raging in eastern Ukraine, And he said, oh, we should just give it up. Just give up Eastern Ukraine. It was never really, it's Russian speaking. It's always been Russian speaking. We should just let it go and have the war be over. What is the sentiment? Is that the sentiment? I know that that's not Zelensky's thoughts at all. I don't know what's right or wrong, but what is the word out in the street about that?
I mean, my general sense, I don't think it's wholly appropriate for me to speak for all Ukrainians, especially since I've been in the States for the past 2.5 months. My general sense is that broadly, a majority of Ukrainians are interested in fighting to maintain Ukraine as Ukraine within the 91 borders. Again, as I think you mentioned before, that one, you give a peace, it's not going to resolve anything. It's not going to end the war. It's only going to exacerbate a situation which is already dire. The other thing that's also, we talk a lot about land, territory, as if it's just, square kilometers or something. But these are people who, unfortunately, so much of this territory and the cities, and it's just been devastated. It's something I don't think my imagination even really goes there, because it's so heartbreaking to understand that places where people lived for generations, they're just in ruins. So Russia is occupying ruins. But still, it's, for all of the people who are there, it's a principle of defending a land where we can live as dignified human beings and govern ourselves, and not be, shells of people groveling around in ruins. That's really the Ukraine that I'm fighting for, that the people who I consider my compatriots are fighting for, and that's kind of the ideal that drives us.
There's another question at the back.
Hi. A question about sort of to balance out your first reading and to provide yin to the yang, perhaps. When living in a war zone, which obviously you haven't done for the last 2.5 months, can you share with us some moments or glimmers of joy that you experienced? Because otherwise, how do you get up every morning? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. The really remarkable thing that I don't think you can quite imagine it unless you've been in a war zone or kind of in a place of violence is how close, like utterly normal life and utter violence and destruction are, side by side. It could be, a certain neighborhood or a city. A bomb explodes in a very specific place. It can explode across the river. I will hear the sound. I will see the smoke out my window. And it's sunshine, springtime, in my neighborhood. And so, like I had mentioned a little bit about the cultural scene being very vibrant. I've gone to the theater a number of times in the past year. I've gone to the movies. I've gone to social dance. I have a social dance habit, we could say. And the Kyiv swing dance community has been holding dances regularly, in addition to holding fundraising drives to buy, all sorts of gear that our friends who are in the armed forces need to survive. And so I find that anytime I have a free moment, whereas my priority is going to be if someone needs me to translate something or, do some fundraising, I will put that first. But if I have a free couple hours on Saturday night, I'm going to go to the dance. And there is, I feel like I very much enjoy the company of my fellow human beings tremendously. Just being able to laugh. My friends in the army who have lost so many of their friends over these years of war, and my friend Ilya, who I mentioned in the reading, one of the things he tells me often, he's like, when I imagine my friends, and would they want to see me sad and down? They want to see me laughing, and and it's like, it's a kind of cold and pragmatic, in a sense, kind of attitude, but you're alive and this is it. Like, this is when you're alive. You're not alive, excuse me, tomorrow or yes, like this is the moment to be alive. This is what you are given, and you try to make the best of it, and joy is definitely a part of that. So if we don't have more questions, I think we could wrap up. I have some books to sell for $20 a piece. I'd be happy to sign them for you. If you have more questions that come up, we can chat in a more informal manner. You also saw this beautiful flag, which is the unit of my friend Ilya, and they, over the course of a couple of years, developed from scratch a very effective combat drone, fixed-wing airplane that performs very important work beyond enemy lines without any permission. It doesn't need permission from the United States or anybody else. They do their work. And so also, if you're interested in contributing a donation to support their work, I can give you their website and tell you a little bit more about them, but they're amongst the wonderful Ukrainians that inspire me to keep going every day. So thank you so much. Thank you, Adrian, for being here on stage with me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette and Natalie and MMCTV and the Richmond Library and Richmond and all of you for being here and keeping Richmond this beautiful community.